Good morning, it's good to see you again. This morning we're continuing our look at the poetry in the Old Testament, the poetry outside of the book of Psalms, that is. And today we're in the book of the prophet Nehemiah. And this is a poetic confession after the Jews had been allowed to return from Babylon and starting to rebuild Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 22 to 28. The people of Israel were praying to Yahweh. You allowed them to defeat neighbouring nations and kingdoms, Heshbon under Sihon and Bashan ruled by Og. You gave them descendants as numerous as the stars, and let them occupy enough land to live in. They overwhelmed the land of Canaan and subdued it. By your power, your people had freedom to dispose of the people and their king. Fortified cities were taken by your people, and with them the fertile land, the wealthy houses, ready-made cisterns, olive groves, orchards and vineyards. They ate their fill and grew portly, enjoying all your good gifts. But your people disobediently rebelled and shunned your law. Prophets who had warned them to turn back, they killed, while they insulted you continually. That's why you let their enemies conquer and rule over them. In deep trouble, they called for help to you. You answered them with mercy from above and sent them leaders to rescue them. But then, once peace had been re-established, they sinned again, and again you let their enemies overcome them. Every time they repented and asked for your assistance, you heard above, and time after time you mercifully rescued them. Nehemiah and Ezra see it as their plain duty to bring the returned exiles to their senses. Having been allowed by their now ascendant Persian overlords to return from exile and rebuild Jerusalem and its ruined temple, they are faced with the practical problems of reoccupying land that had for a generation been reoccupied by pagans. Their first thoughts were that they had to be ready to defend the land the emperor had granted them and re-establish their life and their religion as they thought it had been before. But then their second thoughts took over, and they came to the conclusion that how it had been before had not really been good enough, considering what the nation had been through until very recently. This poem is remarkable for its clarity. It not only confesses to one lapse on the part of Israel, but on multiple serious lapses, each followed by repentance, restoration, and sinning again. So the cycle continued. Ezra and Nehemiah took a very serious view of this habitual return to sin, and if you would like to follow up their remedy for it, there is an easy summary of the agreement they made with God in Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 28 to 39. In it, they promise to interpret the law in as strict a way as possible, so that there will no longer be any chance of infringing it in any way anymore. Thus, we have the beginnings of the Pharisees' interpretation of the lessons to be learnt from the exile and what had caused it. Christians criticised this interpretation very early in our writings. The death of Jesus on the cross and his risen life in his people gave us the opportunity to think again about this human propensity for sin, to ask for help, receive forgiveness and salvation from God, and then sinning again. Yes, we agreed that sinning was in our nature and inevitable, but we did not agree that the solution was to aim for the impossible, which is living a more than perfect life according to the Torah. Nehemiah had put his finger on part of the solution when he pointed out that every time the people called on Yahweh for help and salvation, God was ready to give it. The experience of the cross was the final demonstration of the depth of God's love for his people. God so loved the world, we say, and Christ came into the world to save sinners, quoting St. John and St. Paul. Perfection is not possible for humans. Seeking perfection is, of course, expected of us, but succeeding in finding it isn't. What is expected, what is good news, is God's love for sinners and our response to that love. Tomorrow, we continue our exploration of Hebrew poetry outside of the Book of Psalms with a brief revisit to the Book of Job. I'll see you tomorrow.